HR Research presents our 2014 webinar series, delivering you the latest in HR news, legislative updates, and industry trends. As a provider of leading talent screening, management, and assessment solutions, we are here to ensure your company's continued success. Global HR Research. We redefine your HR expectations.
Hi, everybody. My name is Megan Schamfelter, and I'm the Manager of Communications and Events here at Global HR Research, a leading provider in talent acquisition, talent assessments, and talent screening solutions. For the past 4 years, Global HR has been ranked as one of the top providers of background screening, drug testing, and pre-hire assessment solutions by HRO Today magazine. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today for our webinar entitled The Last Piece of the Puzzle, Pre-Hire Assessments. Today's webinar will be presented by Nguyen, Director of Strategic Relations with Global HR Research. Unfortunately, due to scheduling conflicts, one of our IO psychologists was unable to conduct today's webinar. This will be a silent webinar, so if you have questions, please feel free to type them into your questionnaire box and we will respond throughout the presentation. Questions that may take longer answers or that are more science specific will be answered via email 24 to 72 hours after the completion of this webinar. Also, in this time frame, the entire contents of this presentation will be available on our website, www.ghrr.com. Also, after today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up survey where you'll be able to ask additional questions, make comments, or inquire about Global HR Research Solutions. At this time, I'd like to thank Christine for being here today, and I'll turn this over to her so she can begin today's webinar.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan. All right, guys. So obviously, welcome to today's webinar, basically about adding assessments to your hiring practice. I do want to thank you guys so much for participating. I truly hope this is really beneficial for you. Those of you that know me that are on the line today, you know that I'm going to keep this pretty informal and conversational. So if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them as we go. If not, like I said, Megan said, we'll try to answer these at the end of the webinar. If it's a little more scientific and above my pay grade, then obviously we will get an IO psychologist to respond for you. So before we begin here, just a little bit of background on me for those of you who are not familiar with who I am. I've been with Global HR Research for the past 5 years, and I've worked side by side consulting with some of the U.S.'s largest employers designing pre-employment screening and selection processes. I've even, again, worked with some of you that are on the line today. So if you have any questions, type them in the questionnaire box, and we're going to get started here. So again, I'm going to try to stay away from discussing very complex legal issues today. However, I will talk about some of the legal implications associated with using pre-employment assessments for screening and selection. So that being said, please don't take any of this information as legal advice. This is strictly educational. If you have any further questions concerning legal decisions involving EEOC compliance, I ask that you please seek out legal or professional legal counsel through your appropriate channels. So just kind of talking about today's agenda on the topics I plan on discussing. We'll really begin with a basic overview of assessments, talking about what makes assessments scientific with some basic definitions, and a blending of some theoretical and practical aspects of assessments. Next, we'll talk about, the case for why using assessments in your hiring process is a good idea, and then we're going to take it to some considerations for when you do decide to add scientific assessments to your hiring process. For example, I'll cover some different assessment types, issues on using such, and when to use them, and how to use them. So as I said, I'll provide a broad overview of what some of the legal implications are for using assessments. And then, of course, finally, I'll finish up with some thoughts on selecting vendors, and hopefully there will be some time left for some questions. So with all that bearing in mind, I just want to make sure you guys understand this is a very short amount of time for this subject matter. So I'm going to go through this quickly in a very high-level scale, and I'm going to try to get down to the nitty-gritty that I think would be most important to those of you who are on the line today. Okay, so let's begin with some theoretical aspects of measurement and what we mean when we say scientific measurement, right? Because everyone thinks science, science, science. What does that mean? So here's a quote by a very famous scientist known for his work in thermodynamics and the measurement of temperature, right? So he says, when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely in your thoughts advanced the stage of science, wherever that may be. So let's think about this quote from Lord Kelvin. What does that really mean? Well, it means that in order to advance our knowledge in the stage of science, we need to express it in terms of numbers. Makes sense, right? But let's apply that to the hiring process. What can you express in numbers by a hiring scenario? Is it a gut feeling you have after a face-to-face interview? You can contribute weightings to questions and rank them. You could also do that to resumes, applications. I've seen lots of them. You have applications that come in and you rate and grade them and decide what you to do thereafter. But when we truly talk about scientific measurements, we mean precise, consistent measures that hold up to scrutiny of empirical evidence time and time again, right? And that's going to come into play when we talk about EEOC in the efforts of implementing the pre-selection assessment process. So in the case of making a hiring decision, we now have a solid base of over technically 100 years of scientific research that's applied to the world of work. And depending on what information we can glean from a job's requirements, it's called a job assessment analysis, we're able to use a wide variety of statistical tools to make predictions about future job performance, even before meeting the candidate itself, right? So this is all really possible due to the work over the last century of the areas of what's called industrial and organizational psychology. So when you hear us say IO psychologist or IO anything, it really stands for just industrial and organizational psychology, specifying in organizational behavior, psychometrics, and other areas applied to social science research. So here's the theoretical stuff. I'm going to technically kind of read this to you. I know you guys can read yourself, but the assumptions in assessing people's differences, this is what we all assume, right? People have a variety of attributes that are relatively stable over a period of time. So if you tend to cry at romantic movies, you tend to cry at romantic movies. I'm one of them. And obviously people differ with respect to these attributes, right? I may cry when it's about funny love stories, and someone else may cry when it's about truly romantic, heart-wrenching drama movies. And then relative differences among people along these attributes remain even after training. So someone can try to train me not to cry, but probably still going to cry. And then, of course, different jobs require different attributes. And then, of course, these differences can be measured. And that's the main thing, is the can part. Through a pre-selection scientific assessment process, and there's a million of them out there. We'll talk about what really makes it a science, but it's about the measurement, right? Can I consistently attribute the data, the scores that I'm getting back to actual job performance and function, okay? And when I say attributes, I'm referring to types of cognitive abilities and personality disposition. So you're going to hear things like cognitive general mental ability. Technically, that's the ability to acquire knowledge, regarding aspects such as awareness, perception, reasoning, and judgment. I know these are a lot of big words here, right? Or even personality. For our purposes, that's something like, it's very dynamic, right? It's an organized set of characteristics that uniquely influences a person's thoughts, emotions, motivations, and behavior. So the most popular theory is the Big Five. I think even before I started working with global HR research, I had done, I was in retail before, so I'd done a lot of hiring, firing myself, lots of turnover, and we used the method Big Five, and I always knew what it was, but it never made sense to me. Technically, the Big Five measures 5 things: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and it's called neuroticism, but it's kind of self-worth, all right? Okay, so now that I've talked your ear off about verbiage and kind of what we're going to be discussing today, let's just look at the candidate in general, right? So we already talked about assumptions. The most popular analogy when it comes to assessments is the iceberg. It's what we see as the candidate, right? Such as their resume or behavioral performance during an interview. It's directly in their control, right? It's truly the tip of the iceberg. The resume is created by the candidate. They're going to highlight the most impressive experiences and accomplishments that they want you as the recruiter or HR individual to see. The interview then is really based on performance that can be practiced and is usually highly anticipated, even to the extent of searching interview questions on sites like Glassdoor.com. People do it all the time. I've consulted with multiple businesses, and they always say, well, do you have interview questions? I think to myself, well, sure, but I can make them hard. I can make them difficult. But how does it relate to the job? How does it relate to your organization, your culture? Theoretically, if we look across multiple different industries, and those of you that are on the line, we're going to find some similarities. It's mainly about their experience or their theoretical experience, meaning I'm going to ask you a question, you're going to respond the way that you think I want to hear it. I do interviews here at Global HR Research sometimes with our sales staff. I think to myself, did you say that because you think that's the right answer or you thought I wanted to hear it? Or is that truly how you feel or what you've done in the past? I'm pretty sure if I had like a show of hands, you guys would all say you've heard it before. So thinking about this, the anticipation can actually lead to false negatives, right? So in hiring or making hiring decisions in candidates because they kind of psych themselves out or come in overly prepared. You know it. You see them coming in, they're stressed, they don't know, you don't know how they're anticipating or how their nerves are. So we're human. We want to give them a little bit of out. We go, okay, we'll get you comfortable and then we'll start talking, and we start with the easy questions and get to the harder questions. But what is really, if we look at this graph, what's lurking underneath the water? Because I can look at your resume, your application, I can do a face-to-face or a phone interview. And quite frankly, I'm only getting the top of the iceberg. What attributes does your candidate have that aren't directly observable, right? So we can kind of see the change here, what's underneath that iceberg there. And of course, these attributes likely contribute to how the candidate presents themselves, but if you aren't using an objective approach to assessing these differences, you're kind of missing the mark, right? So what happens is you have these underlying traits, and pre-employment assessments aimed at measuring cognitive ability, personality, integrity, even decision-making attributes and emotional intelligence are a great way to capture additional information about your candidates. So I'm going to kind of detour off the path here a little bit. I like to talk about real life scenarios, real life conversations to kind of bring it back home. I've had this argument, or not, I don't want to call it an argument, but I've had this conversation with clients, prospective clients, in my consulting role, where they have said, well, our recruiters spend a lot of time, they know our fit and our culture. I'm not going to argue with you. I've heard people say, well, I can look at a resume and an application and just know, based on the way they have their resume, I can know on the phone, face-to-face, if they're going to be the right fit for the organization. I can agree with you. I am not telling you that that's not true. What I'm saying is, if I told you I could give you another tool to give your recruiter, your interview specialist, your hiring manager, whoever it is, another set of options to look at when evaluating candidates, would you say no to me? Right? Because that's really all pre-selection assessments are. When we implement these, clients get kind of, I'll call it weirded out. They go, oh my gosh, what happens if someone doesn't score very well in the assessment? That's fine. We're not going to auto-reject them just because of that. It's just based on values that aren't already determined based on resume, application, phone interview, face-to-face interviews. Okay? All right. Before I move forward, does anybody have any questions? Again, this is a silent webinar, so type them into the questionnaire box. I'll try to answer them to the best of my abilities. Megan, do we have any questions so far?
Nope, no questions so far.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So let's get in this. I know I kind of got into why assessments, right? But let's dive a little bit deeper. Technically, when we talk about the basics of assessments, it's including some pretty technical and theoretical info in psychology and assessments. Hey, I'm not an IO psychologist. Some of you on the phone may have the background. IO psychology and human resources kind of go hand in hand there. But as I said, for more information, obviously just contact me here. But we're going to move on and we're going to talk about why it makes sense to add assessments to your selection process. So let's look at this typical hiring process. I know not everyone's the same. But technically, really, every organization has one, right? You have a workflow. And a lot of them are very similar to the process, probably plus or minus some different processes or what I'll call levels there. For our purpose, let's just take note of how with each step we screen out a candidate, right? So phase one, application comes in, I may screen them out or whatever it is. Think about this. When you add assessments, all it is, like I've said in the past, is just adding in another layer, right? You're still doing your same processes. You're just getting another layer to look at before you make that decision for eligibility. Okay. So these processes, technically, without pre-selection assessments, they're centered around collecting and evaluating candidate information, right? It's collection of resumes, applications, interviews via phone or traditional one-on-one interviews, test and other written assessments. I've seen a lot of times, skills assessments. They come in, I want to make sure that they can type. I want to make sure they can use Microsoft, Outlook, Excel, Word, whatever it is, and even doing background checks and drug tests and all these other things. But we're not talking about the personality of the person. How do they fit? Number one, the company culture. Number two, how do they fit the job that I need them to do, right? So it doesn't really collect or document the skills and traits of that individual. That person may be able to type 150 words per minute. Great. I'm asking them to be in a leadership role. Can they lead our staff with an open mind? Do they lead by example, right? Okay, so I'm going to pause this real quick, and I'm going to take a poll just briefly, all right? And with all polls, I'm going to ask you guys to answer as honestly as possible, and I'll share with you the results here. But really is, right now, I just want to know, those of you on the line, where in your current process are you using assessments? And the options are, if you need a little bit of explanation, every applicant that applies, or after you've already selected them, maybe you've screened out some applications, maybe after a phone interview or after a face-to-face interview, or if you don't use any today. So let me share this with you. It's interesting, right? Because 4% of you have said that you are doing assessments directly after every application. 19% of you are saying, only for pre-selected applicants, meaning you've looked at the application, decided whether or not you want to even spend the time doing assessments. 4% of you said after the initial phone screen, 15% of you said after the face-to-face interview, and then 67% of you, which is probably why you're in today's webinar, right? You're not currently using assessments. So I'm kind of excited about this because it tells you there's no rhyme or reason of when you use them. The point of this webinar is to, basically consult with you guys and say, this might be a process that you want to include. Doesn't matter where or when. Obviously, I have my own insights. If you want to ask me what my recommendation would be, I can give that to you. But it's a great tool. So the key here really is the collection of candidate information, right? And a pre-selection assessment is just another piece of information, but in my eyes, a very important piece. We look at this cartoon, right? No matter how great the application looks, again, it's that person, and you'll see here, he's blowing up this giant balloon that talks about all the things that he has. It's a little strange cartoon, I agree, but sometimes we get carried away. I've done it. I've looked at a resume getting really excited to do an interview with someone, not thinking about, do they meet our needs? Are they going to fit our culture? And so the point I want to drive home today is really, despite any claims of how wonderful your process is or how foul-proof it is today, implementing a selection tool isn't going to hurt anybody. It's only just going to add to the process, right? Now, this might not apply to every position. For example, if someone has a criminal background and there's an automatic disqualifier, then yeah, those obviously, that you can't employ those individuals. But before you do it, before you run the background check, before you spend any additional money, do assessments. All right. So the science behind selection, using assessments in the selection process, there's been a lot of studies that have been on this, and quite frankly, assessments lead to 3 times greater predictability of future job success. I mean, you have technically a century of tests that have been done over several decades of testing. And when you look at this, it's been standardized. There's objective comparisons between candidates. This is across all social boards. And how do I say this? Not every assessment has gone through a validation, right? It's funny, when I first started in this industry, I thought to myself, oh, an assessment is an assessment. But there's so many different theories of personality. There's so many different theories of predictability. But the point is, like we talked about in the very beginning with this quote, numbers are numbers. And we'll talk about when you're looking to implement this, what you should be asking your vendor. And one of those questions is, are your tests validated? How are they validated? Over what period of time? And how do they show predictability of future job success? That's the key point of it. There's a lot of personality tests. For example, again, when I first started this industry, I was doing probably assessments off the board because I was so fascinated by this industry. You know, my background was in, it's weird, but my background was in pharmacology. I had a minor in psychology, and this caught my eye. I was like, this is great. I took so many different assessments. They were all different. Like, one assessment I took told me that I was an introvert. Those of you that are on the line that I have worked with, spoken to, even you listening to me now, I am clearly not an introvert. But it was very strange because if you think about it, am I an introvert or am I an introvert at work, at home, with social settings? What is it? So again, it's about future job success. So really, how scientific assessments are improving the hiring process. If you really think about this, modern assessment tools are improving it because they're giving you that extra layer, what's underneath the water, right? And the analysis of specific cognitive personality behavior traits lead to more accurate hiring decisions because you're looking at what we call behavioral, right? And then, of course, psychological attributes of the candidate before you truly make a decision, right? I'm running through this pretty quickly, so I'm hoping I'm not like boring the heck out of you guys or even, I don't know, confusing you. But if you guys have any questions, please type them into the questioner box. I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. I'm going to move on. You know, we've discussed the basics, including some of the reasons why it makes sense to add assessments to our hiring process. You know, and as I said before, just let me know if you have questions, but we're going to talk about assessment essentials and important considerations, right? Considering assessments. Megan, I hear you. So is there a question?
When do you use assessments?
Oh, that's a great question. So theoretically, you should be using assessments in a pre-selection process, right? You can also use it during employment. I'm not going to talk about that today. We're going to focus on the pre-selection. If you're talking about that funnel, so let me go back here. If we look at this hiring process workflow, you know, when we look at that poll, it varies. You know, people do it right after every application. You know, they'll assign it to candidates after they've looked at their resume or application, or after a phone screen, or even a face-to-face interview. Here's the deal. Depending on your vendor, that's probably going to dictate a lot of your decision, right? I can't speak on behalf of every single vendor that offers assessments out there. So I'll speak on behalf of what Global HR Research offers. A part of our programs when we do assessments, there's several different ways that you can purchase the product. You can buy a bulk and you'll have, you know, let's call it 100 assessments that you can use at whim. We can give you a subscription fee where you can pay for a subscription and have unlimited access to assessments. Or you pay for them as you go. That will probably dictate where in the funnel. When I go in and I consult with a lot of our clients or even our prospective clients, I often say right after the application, you want to have all of your candidates go through a screening or pre-selection assessment tool. Number one, when we get to the EEOC section, they talk about fairness and making sure that everyone goes through the same process, even when it comes to application, pre-selection assessments, background screening, drug testing. So if you're looking at an application, you're probably going to have specific knockout questions like, are you eligible to work in the United States? You answer yes, great. You answer no, automatic knockout, you get the thanks but no thanks automatic email. After that, so they complete the application, they can be considered. I would highly recommend at that point doing at least the first level of pre-selection assessments, even if it's the big 5, a generalized psychological assessment. So before you're even evaluating the resume, the application, or thinking about doing a phone or face-to-face interview, you have that extra something to look at, right? The second part of that, I've also recommended to our clients, or even prospective clients, is doing a proctored assessment after the face-to-face or phone interview. So now you've decided, okay, I really do like this person. They are truly my top candidate I want to bring on for, requisition 1, 2, 3. Let's do a more extensive, more comprehensive assessment that is more related to the job type. So first assessment, more generalized about the company, the culture, about personality. Second assessment, I call it a proctor, it doesn't have to be proctored, but I call it a proctored assessment after the face-to-face or phone interview. When you've decided, okay, this is the person for this position, and doing a more in-depth assessment. All right, I hope I answered whoever asked that question. I know it was kind of lengthy and I didn't give you all of it, but I hope that helped. Okay, so let's talk about common assessments, how assessments are deployed, when and where to use them, purchasing process, important outcomes, and having kind of an assessment strategy. So common assessment tools. What do you intend to assess? I mean, that's the first question, right? What type of assessments will you use? It's extremely important to be asking 3 questions prior to deploying them. Most likely, the best solution is a mix of different tools. For example, cognitive ability, personality, behavioral, like customer service type of things, motivation, judgment making. I mean, I can name you a million. But it also depends on what competencies your job requires. So first and foremost, before you want to implement assessments, a job analysis must be conducted. Everyone's probably going, what does that mean? Some of you were probably going, I've already done that, or I don't want to do that, that sounds crazy, or I've done that before and it was really extensive. There are different theories to job analysis. Depending on the position, it's really looking at your job description, day-to-day functions, culture, and fit, right? Kind of in the olden days, when I say olden, probably 10, 15, 20 years ago, you normally had an industrial and organizational or IO psychologist come in. They did analysis of all your top level performers and said, okay, in order to perform this job, you have to have X, Y, and Z attributes. That was a job analysis. Nowadays, with I guess, the popularity of assessments, it can be done directly with vendors like Global HR Research. There's a million of them out there. With an IO psychologist on staff, we'll look at your job descriptions, we'll look at your culture, your fit, we'll talk to each of your what we call designated employer representatives, so your C-level decision makers, and talk about what you or they would attest or assume would be a good candidate for the position. That's all compiled together and provided to you as a job analysis. On top of that, at that point, provide you what's called an assessment module or an assessment battery. Batteries are more technical and they use them, I call them modules because, I don't know, that's what I call them. All right, let's get to the next slide here. So again, there's several options when you think about the types of psychological assessments to choose. Organizational culture fit is a very hot topic, right? I keep talking about it, and one to definitely consider when making that choice. Every organization has a unique culture. I don't care what industry you are. Everyone's unique. And it's not just the values you have written on the walls. I think everyone says, or, I'll ask people, what's your culture? And they'll spill me out, all these like bullet point items that are on the poster or, in the elevator or in the lobby. And I think to myself, organizational culture is kind of the genetic makeup of your organization. I guess simply, it's the way that we do things around here, right? This is what we do. This is how we do it. This is what we believe in. It's not just bullet points on a poster. So the time and the effort to discover and develop your true culture archetype is most likely well worth the benefit of being able to select candidates who will not only fit into your culture, but also thrive and engage in your organization. Culture fit assessments will surely add utility. So other pre-employment assessments you may currently use, or decide to implement. Okay. So let's talk about deployment across the organization. How will you implement and deploy assessments if you guys decide to move forward? And when we talked about that poll there, 67% of you that are on the line today do not currently use assessments. Questions you must absolutely be asking when considering adding assessments to your hiring process, right? Think about them. How do I say this? For small organizations, it might be beneficial to use a as-needed basis, right? For larger scaling organizations, it might be best to assess all candidates, right? Essentially, we're talking about off-the-shelf versus fully customized implementation. There are benefits and consequences for either option. Again, this is a question that you should focus on when deciding how to add assessments to your hiring process. I hope that didn't confuse you guys. It's a very hard question. People always say, well, what if we've never done this before? Number one, as an organization, you need to decide, is this something that we want to do and believe in it, right? I think I've seen the program different ways. I've seen organizations not ever do assessments before, implement them, and those that have the decision-making power, they believe in the product, they believe that it's going to work, and it works successfully. Anytime there's a hesitancy of doubt, I think at one point I had somebody say to me, well, I don't believe that hocus pocus. And I said, okay, well, assessments is probably not for you, and I'm okay with that. But you've got to believe, because if you don't, you're not going to understand the data. You're going to continually question the data that comes back, even though it's been scientifically validated. So that's the first step. Do you want to do this? Do you believe in the process? And then does your team around you support that decision? The other thing is your candidate's experience. This is huge, right? I probably spent, an hour and a half of my time yesterday talking to a prospective client, and it was about background screening and applicant tracking stuff, but they were so huge on candidate experience because their current vendor just had an awful program, and they walked me through it, and I walked them through ours, and I thought to myself, I would never apply for a position with this organization if that was the experience that I had. And so it gets even, I guess, more of a hot topic when we talk about assessments. People have said to me, well, I just want to make it easy. I want my candidates to apply. I want them to be able to go through the process and not have to do this other thing, right? Okay. I've also heard, well, what if the candidate doesn't complete the application? Okay, well, let's think about this. I want to employ somebody. I'm going to ask them to do a job function. I'll probably have daily functions that they need to perform, and I need them to follow instruction. Okay, great. We can agree on that. So in order for someone to apply for a job, I'm asking them to fill out an application and or send me a resume. Also follow instructions. It's kind of like self-selection. If the candidate doesn't complete the assessment as a part of your hiring process, isn't that self-selection? I know that people talk about, well, again, I want my candidate just to apply. Assessments can contribute to a great experience, or it can be a bad one, right? It's depending on how you implement them. So depending on your industry, like I said, someone asked, the question that was asked of me earlier, when do we implement assessments? That's my recommendation, but it's not going to fit everyone's model. It just won't. You've got to look at the different types of candidates that you're hiring and then find out, when is it best? What job functions is it best for? First and foremost, like any selection process, just think about it, right? Think about it and understand it's not a downside to your candidate. It's actually an upside, because someone who wants to work for your organization is going to complete an assessment like they would an application. And again, it gives you a better understanding of that person, so you're better prepared for that phone interview or that face-to-face interview. Or you're better prepared when that person is onboarded. You know where they need help, things where their strengths and their weaknesses are. So it's a win-win for both parties. Okay, so types of positions benefiting from, positions here. Again, I know you guys can read. I'm not going to read these out loud to you. But before I get to this, I want to go back to the candidate experience real quick. I have a poll here, and I want you guys to be honest, because like I said, I've talked to a million different people. It's strange to me, but some people have said, yes or no to this. I'm not going to tell you the percentage because I want to see how you guys respond, and then I'll tell you what I normally hear. I want to know, Do you believe your candidates have a good experience today when applying for positions with your organization?
We have one question for you. We have one person wanting to know, how can we identify our company's culture when we might be in a community that is a different area of the U.S.? So how might we be able to know our individual culture?
Sure. So I think as U.S. citizens or even Americans, we think of culture as like segmented social groups. Culture is about your company. So for example, I'll use global HR research. There you go, because I can discuss that, right? I'm not implicating anybody that's on the line today. So I'll use global HR research as an example here. Our culture is that we want to be able to provide, in whatever services that we do, the best customer service possible to our clients and to our staff, period. That's our culture. Probably very similar to those of you that are on the line. You want to provide great candidate experience, great employee experience, and those that you serve a service to, your clients, your vendors, whatever they may be. That is a culture, not just based on region, not just based on location, but it truly is what, in a nutshell, does your company feel is your culture. It's, like I said, it's one of those things that when you ask somebody what they think their company culture is, you'll always find that everyone says something different, right? It's always like sometimes it's a variation, but it's always different. No one can ever tell you exactly what it is. So the first step is always to figure that out, because then you can really do a job analysis. I hope that helps. Just don't think of company culture as kind of a regional or locational deal, but it's more of a company-wide. How do we want to treat our staff, our potential, candidates, and even our clients, vendors, so on and so forth. So the question again was, do you honestly feel that your candidates have a good experience when applying for positions at your organization? Okay. I was going to say it's normally 50 and 50. I'm pretty close, 59, 41%, right? Most people will blame this on their applicant tracking system. That's what they'll do. They'll blame it, or either from the application standpoint or from the administrative side of how you're handling or managing the workflow, right? If your ATS was just really intuitive and more customizable, the candidate experience would be way better. Here's the deal. When you add in assessments to your candidate, it is that one step. That's more than the next person, right? I would love to tell you that 80% of the companies, out there are using some type of psychological assessment. We've already discovered 67% of you on the line today are not. Okay, so there's less of you using assessments than there are more of you. It's that extra factor. In fact, when I applied for global HR research, I was applying for a lot of different jobs at that time. I did an assessment with this company. I thought to myself, that's strange. They must be really interested in me. I'm going to make sure that I fill that out. It was something unique to me. It made me feel like they were looking at more than what was just on paper, right? You have candidates that are hoping and praying they get to that phone interview or that face-to-face interview, and it's that staged process. We have a company here locally in Fort Myers, Florida. They plan on hiring I think 600 or 700 people in the next 2 years or something, and they have I think it's like an 11 or 12-step process when it comes to selecting their candidates, and they have assessments. And I've heard people complain a million times, oh, it's such a horrible experience. You go through all these different stages, but they never complain about the assessment. They only complain about all the different stages. I had this interview with this person, then an interview with a panel, and then an interview with this person. So it's not uncommon for me to see or hear people say, my candidate experience is great or it's not great. The biggest thing is, how can we help improve it? Right? How do we make you different to where the candidate feels like you were actually considering them for the position? All right, I'm going to go back to my slide here real quick. So again, here's some examples of types of industries and positions that we see a lot of movement in for utilizing pre-selection assessments. Oh, let me hide this real quick. There we go. Even though implementing pre-employment assessments is effective in a variety of situations, there are serious implications involved with legal defensibility of your selection system, which we will discuss here shortly. But the biggest thing is, no strategy is still a strategy, right? And most often a bad one when it comes to hiring. We can agree? All right. So when we talk about choosing a vendor, this should be like a no-brainer for everybody. But the RFP process can be time consuming, but it really does allow you to learn a lot more about your vendors and start building a relationship before you enter into a contract. I have gotten into situations or consultations with prospective or even current clients who are using assessments, and I'll say, well, how did you guys decide on that specific assessment? Oftentimes, the price was right, or I found it online. No joke, I'm telling you the truth. And I think to myself, okay, how did you validate that they even relate to the job function? They'll kind of give you this look like, what do you mean? It tells me if they're a happy person. Well, great. Maybe I don't need a happy person all the time in billing. Maybe I just need someone to just get down, start coding, and start billing immediately. Personality is personality, but again, it's how does it relate to the job? If you guys ever need any help, for those of you that have not implemented assessments and want to start implementing them, and you need help kind of getting together questions for your RFP, please utilize us as a resource. We've helped a lot of our clients put them together for assessments, background screening, drug testing, applicant tracking, so on and so forth. We're here. And the biggest thing is we want to make sure that what's best for you is best for the industry. Some might say this is one of the most important considerations, right? Thinking about how you will evaluate the effectiveness of the assessment program you implement, right? It goes back to really how you choose an assessment. What predictors of job performance are you focused on? What metrics are you looking to see to change really after implementation? There are plenty of outcomes you might want to consider, for example, turnover, retention, manager performance ratings, cost of hire, manager opinion feedback or surveys. Some of you may even take it a step further and think about increased sales and in revenue, increased profits, maybe your own internal validation studies. But whatever it is, have your metrics, because you should have a standard beforehand, and then when you implement assessments, you should be able to see the increase of effectiveness, right? And when you're doing that RFP process, you should be asking that vendor if they have a case study of how they were able to implement assessments that was able to directly tie to effectiveness of job performance within the organization. Using assessments strategically. Another important consideration involves using assessment data, like this big term this term we're using that's it's not quite new, but it's like the big thing right now is big data for talent management and workforce development. You can use this information to better understand the, determinants of job performance, to create standards for selection, employee training and development, or even succession planning. So I'm going to go back to that original question that someone asked me. When do you use assessments? Again, pre-selection, helping standardize selection for, again, that pre-selection tool, employee training and development, and succession planning. It's just what type of assessment are you really looking to implement? Assessment data also allows you to see really the ROI of your assessment process. So if you're not seeing some correlation between the scores of your employees and job performance, turnover, manager evaluations, and so on and so forth, you may really not be using the right configuration, or you may need to look at other selection tools, right? Like your interviewing process. So don't just, the term's like set it and forget it. You really want to be following up on your validation studies throughout the talent management life cycle. And I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here, but that's my spiel on implementing assessments. Okay, so let's get to some stuff that I know is probably on the top of your head. It's imperative for those of you who are thinking about or currently using any type of pre-employment selection testing to observe and understand the laws. As HR pros, I'm sure that this is just going to be a refresher, and I'm not, I'm only presenting like 3 slides or 4 slides or something like that, just because there's so much that's involved in this. I just want to give you very high level and then give you my final thoughts. Oh, our favorite person, the EEOC. Psychological and behavioral testing falls under the purview of the EEOC, and they have research psychologists that solely focus on compliance to Title VII. My slide is a little off there. I'm not joking with you guys. We sent a few of our industrial and organizational psychologists to conference last year. They're having another one again this year called SIOP, the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychologists. They had an entire half day with an IO psychologist with the EEOC speaking on behalf of assessments. A half day. It was insane. They came back and they're like, Christine, you know, our compliance team, our directorship, our executive team, we went through every single notes that they took because the EEOC really is focusing on this, right? If we look at Title VII, basically it says, you know, it permits employment tests as long as tests are not, quote, designed, intended, or used to discriminate because of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. I'm going to repeat that real quick. It permits employment tests as long as tests are not, again, quote, designed, intended, or used to discriminate because of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Okay, I'm gonna keep going here, and I'm going to start reading this, and I want to talk about how that relates to us in this conversation today. Title I of the ADA, you know, prohibits private employers, state and local governments from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities on the basis of their disabilities. It's kind of strange that they would label it that way. And then age discrimination, and in the Employment Act, prohibits discrimination based on age, 40 and over, with respect to any term, condition, and privilege of employment. Under the ADEA, covered employers may not select individuals for hiring, promotion, or reductions in force in a way that unlawfully discriminates on the basis of age. Okay, so let's look at this. So pretty much all of you are probably familiar with the information that's on this slide here, but I'm curious a little bit, how many of you are really aware of all this information? Because if 67% of you today on today's line aren't using assessments, have you really thought about this? Our IO psychologists will always say to us, you know, look at the 1978 guidelines. It serves as a technical guidance for determining and demonstrating evidence that pre-employment tests are in compliance with the EEOC, right? But are they really? Because if I go back to, and let me get back to my quote here, they're looking at, does it discriminate, or is it designed, intended, or used to discriminate because of race, color, sex, or religion? If you're using off-the-shelf, I found it online assessments, how are we determining that we're within EEOC guidelines? How are we determining validity of job function? How are we determining that it is valid across cultures, societies, ages, sex, religion, all these different things? Test validation. That's the biggest thing. So demonstrating job relatedness is test validation. Let's talk about best practices for testing and selection. Again, I'm not going to read you the slide, but here's a summary. I won't go over each of these individual items in the interest of time, obviously. But this webinar, as a reminder, will be available in its entirety on our website for your reference. If you want to go back to this, you can. But I will say this, obviously there are many concerns with the use of assessments when it comes to legal defensibility. You know, this is why assessment professionals must stay current with changes in the field and have very thorough training in advanced research methods, statistical analysis, and the law, not to mention the theoretical, keyword, and historical underpinnings of applied psychology. So don't just buy assessments online. Buy it from someone who has an IO psychologist that's aware of EEOC regulation, is aware of the validity testing, and how it relates to job function, right? The good news is that the field has advanced, right? The industrial and organizational psychology has advanced a lot, really, since 1978. And there have been a lot of discussions currently, or there are currently discussions underway with the EEOC to reevaluate some of these practices to keep up with advances in science, technology, and the world of work. You guys will probably think about it too. You're dealing with EEOC stuff every day. You're going, how does this relate to today? It's kind of like that with psychology. The problem is a lot of it is theoretical. Anytime you're dealing with psychology, obviously there are numbers to help attribute it to a scientific matter, but the EEOC looks at it as theoretical still. So nonetheless, having an informed professional to guide you right through all of these things, through the critical issues, legal issues with your legal counsel, the end result really is that you guys are or as the employer, the ultimate responsibility lies on you. So that's why when I say when you choose a vendor or function, make sure that you're a partner. They're not just giving you a product. You're not just going to pay for it because it costs you, less money that month. Think about how this is being implemented, kind of like background checks and drug tests, which I'm a little more familiar with than assessments. But I think about this and I say, just don't do it based on price, because what is that one civil action lawsuit going to cost you in comparison to taking that time and considering job relatedness and where you're getting these assessments from? Okay. So some final thoughts, really. We'll wrap up the webinar with some suggestions for finding reputable assessments and vendors. So first, let's talk about how to choose an assessment vendor. There are thousands, literally thousands of employment testing products and services in the marketplace. And they vary in many ways, including cost, time to administer, and overall quality. What I'm going to ask you guys to do, just like you would do with your background screen or drug testing vendor, do the vetting, right? Do the vetting. You want to know the validity of the testing and how it relates to the job, and if they're going to do a job analysis for you or with you, okay? Here's some great questions really to ask during the vetting process. This is actually taken directly from SIOP, that's Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology website. So when you're speaking to vendors, make sure you ask most, if not all, of the following questions. The link is below, so whenever you guys do, we have this posted to the website, or I'll give you guys a few minutes if you want to write that down. I doubt it. But really ask a lot of these questions. And here they are. Okay? I'll read them. It's kind of the point. What is the test measure? So if I'm doing an assessment battery or module, what specifically are we measuring? What research and processes was used to develop the test? So the validity portion of it. What experience and or education do you have that qualifies you to develop and or sell this test? That's really key. You're going to have, without naming the specific assessment, there are a lot of distributors that are out there that will resell assessments. Right? Like I said, there's thousands of vendors that are out there, and they don't know a darn thing with it. They just know that as a part of the human capital space, assessments are getting hot and it's great money. So I'm going to sell it alongside whatever it is. But they don't understand the science behind it or understand the validity behind it. They're just trying to sell your product, right? What evidence do you have related to the reliability of the test? What evidence do you have related to the validity of this test? What evidence do you have that demonstrates the lack of bias or discrimination in your test? To me, number 6 is one of the key questions you need to ask, right? Because it has to do all about Title VII with the EEOC. And of course, what data do you have that will help me interpret test scores in my organization? The other thing is when you're buying products off the shelf, which is fine. I'm not dissing that. Do it. Just ask all the questions to begin with. Make sure it's the right fit before you implement. But when you get the data, do you know functionally how to read it? Do your recruiters know? Do your hiring managers, whoever's looking at this data, are you all evaluating, looking at data the same way? And then last but not least, just kind of takeaways here. No one pre-employment assessment is the end-all be-all solution for guaranteeing the perfect hire, right? Again, it's just an extra tool on top of your normal process that helps you kind of look at, again, under the iceberg for the candidate. What makes a great pre-employment assessment is the thoughtfulness and planning that goes into how well some assessments are selected and implemented. And then you guys as decision makers need to carefully think about what psychological and behavioral constructs they intend to assess, right? So think about really what you want to assess as it relates to the job and the company culture. The vendors of the assessments that they choose, the consultants that you hire to help implement them, and the criteria that they will use to evaluate this process. But again, I want to thank you guys for joining the webinar. I hope it was really informational and beneficial to you. As I said, it's a very complex topic that requires a lot of education and experience to gain the expertise in. But erring on the side of cautiousness, you guys hopefully got a lot of information. If you have any specific questions, Megan and I will be on the line probably for the next 5 minutes or so. Okay, guys, I think that there's no more questions, so I'm going to close this webinar. And again, I thank you guys for joining us. You guys have a wonderful day.